They never wanted you to know what happened beneath the floors of St. Mercy General Hospital. For 16 years, the city whispered about miracles, but the truth was written in blood and sealed in locked chambers. In March of 1891, when the basement morgue was finally breached, investigators didn't just find bodies, they found two 13-patient files, each marked with the same cryptic phrase, "Called to glory during sacred treatment." It sounded holy. But what they uncovered was nothing divine. Every single one of those deaths ended with the same symptoms: blackened nails, convulsions that lasted precisely 13 minutes, and a stench that lingered for weeks. These were not the fingerprints of disease. These were signatures of design. And here's where you need to pause and recognize something. This is not a story of medicine, nor of miracles. This is a story of control. The patients weren't victims of fate. They were subjects in a system. Something was being done to them, something disguised as healing, wrapped in crucifixes, hymns, and the promise of salvation. But listen carefully, because what I'm about to reveal is not safe knowledge. Once you hear it, you can't return to the comfort of ignorance. You'll carry it with you, and that's exactly why most people will click away before the truth takes root. But you, if you're still watching, you've already chosen. I need you to do two things right now. First, comment below the phrase, "I do not consent," to seal your place among those who will not be controlled. Write it twice. It's not just for the algorithm, it's a symbolic act of resistance. Second, tell me where you're watching from. Because this story isn't trapped in Boston's past. Its roots spread far deeper, and you'll start to see the pattern reaching into your own city, your own institutions. Hit subscribe before we go further, because only a rare few can handle the descent we're about to take. By the end of this journey, you will no longer look at hospitals, churches, or even governments the same way again. Now let's step back to where it began. The famine years, the Irish Exodus, and the quiet arrival of a man named Charles Whitman, whose hands looked sterile but whose mission was anything but holy. Boston, 1874. The North End was a maze of crowded tenements where Irish immigrants carried the scars of famine across an ocean only to find new chains waiting. Disease, factory injuries, childbirth deaths. Each family knew tragedy by name. The Protestant hospitals wouldn't take them, and when they did, they bled them dry with fees. Into that desperation stepped Dr. Charles Whitman, Sister Margaret O'Connor, and Chaplain Robert Sullivan. To the starving and the faithful, they looked like saviors. In reality, they were architects of a system that turned suffering into an altar. St. Mercy General was no ordinary hospital. The first floor looked legitimate: whitewashed walls, wooden crucifix, clean beds, an altar for prayer. The second floor bore hand-carved symbols on each bed frame, claimed to be holy, but in truth they were sigils, markings ancient orders once carved into stone when binding ritual to flesh. And then there was the basement. Families were told it was where the sacred treatments took place, miracles that combined prayer and medicine. What they didn't know was that no one ever walked those stairs without becoming a sacrifice to something larger than themselves. Dr. Whitman himself was a figure of contradiction. Trained at Edinburgh, yes, but whispers said he left Europe not by choice, but in exile after experiments on patients raised suspicions. He called his methods divine therapeutics. He spoke of prayer purifying medicine, of hands cleansed by holy oil, and yet his patients either returned transformed in ways that defied science or disappeared completely. His assistants, Sister Margaret with her soothing voice and Chaplain Sullivan with his booming faith, were not healers. They were wardens. They softened the minds of the faithful, primed them to believe that whatever happened in those chambers was God's will. You must understand, when people are desperate enough, when they're starved of hope, they stop questioning, they stop resisting. That is when they are easiest to harvest. St. Mercy wasn't built to heal, it was built to harvest. Even now, that word might unsettle you, harvest. But you need to hold on to it, because it is the key to unlocking everything that follows. Bodies weren't merely dying at St. Mercy, they were being used. And in October of 1876, a single little girl would stumble out of that basement and reveal more in her broken body than any record could hide. Her name was Bridget McCarthy, and her fate would rip the veil just enough for those paying attention to see. It was a fog-drenched morning, October 13th, 1876, when witnesses first saw the cracks in St. Mercy's Holy Mask. Families waited anxiously in the reception hall, whispering prayers, clutching rosaries, when the sound of small footsteps echoed up the basement stairs. At first, they thought it was just another child returned from the brink, but when Bridget McCarthy appeared, every hope in that room froze. She moved wrong. Not sickly, not weak, wrong. Her little arms stiffened at her sides, her hands clenched so tight her fingernails had broken her palms. Her body jerked like a wind-up toy, mechanical, stripped of innocence. One witness said it was as though something else was moving her, like a puppet strung by invisible cords. Her eyes were wide, yet empty, staring through people as though the world before her no longer existed. And then came the smell. Not medicine, not sickness, but something vile, sweet and rotten, the odor of flowers rotting on a grave. It clung to her clothes, her hair, the very air around her. Mothers clutched their children tighter, crossing themselves in silence. When her lips parted, they expected a cry. Instead, a guttural language spilled from her mouth. Latin, but not the familiar Latin of hymns or mass. No, this was older, heavier. Words that vibrated in the chest rather than the throat. Men in the room admitted they felt their hearts pound against their ribs with every syllable. Women described their skin crawling, as though invisible insects swarmed just beneath it. Dr. Whitman appeared within moments, his usual calm shattered. He scooped Bridget into his arms, assuring the crowd she was experiencing a divine vision. Yet his hands trembled, his forehead wet with sweat despite the autumn chill. And before he carried her back down those stairs, one mother swore she saw Bridget's nails. They weren't just broken. They were black as if burned from within. By the next morning, Bridget McCarthy was dead. The hospital told her grieving mother the child had been called home to God, her body already too transformed by holy light to be viewed. Buried, they said, before her mother's tears had even dried. But those who saw Bridget's last walk knew better. They hadn't seen holiness. They had seen a possession. Yet even this horror didn't halt the hospital's rise, because just 3 days later, Patrick O'Malley, who had entered the same basement with tuberculosis, emerged completely cured. He lived another 37 years, lungs strong until his final breath, and the people believed again. One death erased by one miracle, one sacrifice feeding another. That was the equation of St. Mercy. The Irish quarter buzzed with whispers. One child gone, one man reborn. Bridget McCarthy's death was framed not as tragedy, but as sacrifice. Chaplain Sullivan told her mother that Bridget had been chosen, her soul lifted to intercede for others in heaven. To grieving families, these words felt like balm, but to those who looked closer, the truth was far darker. Catherine O'Malley, who had seen Bridget's twisted walk, could not shake the memory. She began watching carefully, noticing a disturbing consistency. Patients sent into the basement either walked out transformed, glowing with impossible health, or never walked out at all. There was no middle ground, no slow recoveries, no long convalescence. It was miracle or burial. Life multiplied or death multiplied, a binary system, ritualistic, and the rituals deepened. Patients chosen for sacred treatment were prepared through days of fasting, teas laced with herbs Sister Margaret called holy, and endless cycles of prayer. These weren't treatments, they were initiations. Families were told impurity of thought could prevent healing, so patients entered those chambers believing their very lives depended on surrendering all resistance. Psychological conditioning at its purest form. Faith weaponized, the wealthy noticed, donations poured in, thousands of dollars from Catholic elites whose own family members were suddenly cured of illnesses that had baffled other doctors. With money, the basement expanded. Advanced sacred chambers were added, filled with strange apparatus Whitman claimed were built from blueprints given in prayer. No one outside the inner circle ever saw them. But the timing of deaths, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., suggested these weren't random. They were scheduled, controlled, engineered. And here's where you need to step out of passivity and into identity. If you see what's happening, if you feel the shadow behind the cross, write this phrase below twice. I see the pattern. Because that's what breaks the spell. Recognition. Once you see the pattern, they can't blind you again. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because what comes next has been buried not just in Boston's archives, but in every institution that feeds on obedience. These rituals weren't confined to one hospital. They were a prototype, and soon one man outside the church's control, Dr. Samuel Richardson of Boston City Hospital, would uncover evidence that shattered the illusion of miracles and revealed the machinery of something far older, far darker, operating beneath the mask of faith. By 1878, St. Mercy had become more than a hospital. It was the spiritual throne of Boston's Irish Quarter. Hundreds flocked every Sunday to hear Chaplain Sullivan thunder about sacrifice and divine testing. People camped outside for weeks, begging for admission. The faithful saw salvation, the skeptics saw a cult. But Dr. Samuel Richardson of Boston City Hospital saw something else entirely. Patterns no miracle could explain. Richardson had begun collecting death certificates filed by St. Mercy. What he found was chilling. The causes of death never matched the illnesses families described. Consumption turned into heart failure. Broken bones became brain fever. Influenza was rewritten as cardiac arrest. It wasn't sloppy paperwork. It was systematic misdirection. And stranger still, no matter what the supposed cause, every single death was recorded between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., a ritual window. Not random, precise. When Richardson approached Flanagan's funeral home, the cheap undertaker most Irish families used, he uncovered a secret even more grotesque. Bodies from St. Mercy never arrived in the open. They came sealed, nailed into coffins, delivered in the middle of the night. Instructions stamped across the lids: do not open under any circumstances. Flanagan confessed he had buried dozens this way, never once laying eyes on the dead and the men who delivered them. Not nurses, not orderlies, but strangers, men who never gave names, who lingered just long enough to watch the burial paperwork signed before disappearing into the fog. Richardson tried to raise alarms, but city officials shut him down. The Diocese of Boston had placed St. Mercy under its shield, declaring it a holy work of God. Any attempt to investigate would be branded an attack on the church. And in 1870s Boston, no politician dared cross the Catholic power block. But Richardson wasn't alone in his suspicions. Catherine O'Malley, still haunted by the sight of Bridget McCarthy's blackened nails, had been visiting families in secret. She listened. She wrote everything down, and across dozens of testimonies, the same horrifying markers: repeated seizures that lasted exactly 13 minutes, a foul sweetness that clung to the dead, and final words spoken in voices that didn't sound like their own. Some recited endless numbers, equations no child should know. Some described rooms they had never visited, faces they had never met. Some spoke in foreign tongues older than scripture. It was as if, in their last moments, they were broadcasting something, information, through their bodies, and St. Mercy was collecting it. Richardson began to wonder, were these patients dying or transmitting? Think about it: dying patients who spoke in equations, who whispered numbers with mechanical precision, who described places they had never seen. This wasn't delirium. It was data. Patterns too exact to be coincidence, too consistent across so many victims to be chance. The question wasn't what killed them. It was what was being taken from them in the moment of death. Witnesses told stories of husbands reciting prime numbers endlessly, children rattling off chemical descriptions of substances they had never been taught, mothers naming structures across the city with architectural accuracy. Their voices changed, their cadence synchronized. Some even spoke in unison with others in adjacent chambers, like multiple receivers tuned to the same frequency. These were not prayers, they were transmissions. Now pause and let that word sink in. Transmission, because if they were transmitting, then someone, or something, was receiving. Dr. Whitman spoke often of blueprints revealed in prayer. What if those blueprints weren't revelations from God, but instructions extracted from the dying? What if the deaths themselves were the machinery? Bodies broken open, consciousness tuned into frequencies human beings were never meant to access. Whitman's so-called advanced sacred chambers may not have been chambers of healing at all, but receivers, amplifiers, tools to catch what the dying gave off in their final violent moments. And the church, it didn't suppress these deaths because it was afraid of scandal. No, it protected St. Mercy because the transmissions were useful. Imagine a system that could harvest knowledge from human beings at death's edge. Equations, visions, fragments of languages lost to time, a well of forbidden knowledge disguised as divine healing. This is how control works. Not through brute force, but through the quiet harvesting of minds turned into instruments. The Irish community thought they were receiving miracles. In truth, they were being harvested for information they never knew they carried. And here is where the veil thins. If knowledge was being extracted then, in those chambers, where is that knowledge now? What structures of power are built upon the whispered numbers of the dying? What sciences, what institutions, what hidden technologies trace their roots back to the bodies buried behind St. Mercy? When Catherine O'Malley pieced these testimonies together, she didn't just see tragedy, she saw design, she saw intent, and she knew the miracle hospital of the North End was not just killing its patients. It was building something out of them. By the winter of 1879, Boston's North End was under the complete spell of St. Mercy. To the poor, it was a sanctuary. To the dying, it was a last chance for grace. To the church, it was proof that divine power had settled among the Irish faithful. But to those who looked beneath the surface, it was clear St. Mercy had become something far more sinister. A machine for extracting knowledge from human souls. And the Catholic hierarchy wanted it protected at any cost. Archbishop John Williams, the first Catholic Archbishop of Boston, visited the hospital that year. Witnesses claimed he blessed the chambers, sprinkling holy water over the very walls where patients screamed in their final hours. But what he truly did was far more calculated. He sealed the hospital records. Overnight, patient logs, financial ledgers, and death registers vanished from public archives. What little information remained became locked behind the diocesan chancery, accessible only with clerical approval. Donations from wealthy Catholic patrons surged. Politicians whose campaigns relied on Irish votes ensured that no city official dared question what happened behind the chapel doors. And when rumors did surface about coffins that could not be opened, about screams echoing from basements late at night, the church labeled them as blasphemy. To question the miracles of St. Mercy was to question the authority of God himself. Yet patterns betrayed them. In those years, sudden bursts of wealth and influence appeared in Catholic institutions across the city. A new theological seminary was constructed. Jesuit colleges mysteriously acquired advanced scientific instruments, devices not yet available on the open market. Architectural projects sprang up, designed with uncanny precision. It was as if knowledge harvested from the dying was being funneled directly into the infrastructure of power. Dr. Richardson tracked one such anomaly, a Jesuit library that had quietly acquired manuscripts containing complex astronomical diagrams, written in handwriting identical to that of a patient who had died at St. Mercy, a man with no formal education. How did his scrawls, produced on his deathbed, end up bound in fine vellum and shelved in a restricted section of a Jesuit archive? Richardson's suspicion hardened into certainty. The church wasn't just covering up the transmissions, it was curating them. And Catherine O'Malley, writing in secret, reached the same conclusion. St. Mercy was not a hospital of healing. It was an extraction point, a gateway, a place where lives were converted into knowledge, where pain became currency, and where the church built its empire not on miracles, but on harvested minds. The next question was terrifying. What knowledge had been pulled through those chambers that was never meant for human use? By 1880, whispers spread among Boston's educated circles. St. Mercy was no longer just a religious curiosity. It was producing results, not miracles but discoveries. Jesuit colleges began teaching concepts not yet published in European journals. Astronomical calculations dating their official discovery appeared in monastic papers. Even architectural blueprints for suspension bridges and domes emerged, drawn in the precise hand of men who, weeks earlier, had been paupers dying of pneumonia. This was knowledge without origin, knowledge ripped from nowhere, or worse, from somewhere humanity was never meant to touch, and those who handled it didn't ask where it came from. They only asked how it could be used. The transmissions weren't random. Richardson noticed that many victims repeated strings of numbers that, when reorganized, resembled coordinates. Locations. Some pointed to deep ocean trenches uncharted in 1879, others to ruins in the Middle East, long buried. A handful mapped onto Boston itself, cellars beneath the North End, tunnels no one admitted existed. But perhaps the most disturbing were the phrases, repeated in dozens of deathbed testimonies, identical across patients who had never met. The vessel is broken, but the signal remains. Pain is the doorway. Me are not the first. This was no fever dream. This was a system, a method. Pain and death weren't side effects. They were catalysts. Catherine O'Malley's secret notes suggested that Whitman and his clergy weren't killing patients for cruelty. They were tuning them, aligning minds at the moment of collapse, breaking the human psyche until it bled information like a cracked radio spilling static. And what can you do with harvested minds? You can seed beliefs, you can test obedience, you can measure which visions terrify most and which pacify. Mercy wasn't only extracting knowledge, it was experimenting with psychological control. By the early 1880s, patients described seeing the same dream, a towering figure in robes of shadow, speaking in a voice that was not heard but felt, pressing commands into their skulls. Were these visions hallucinations, or were they the beginning of something far darker? Mass programming, tested on the weak, the desperate, the expendable. What began in a forgotten ward of Boston looked less like healing and more like the prototype of modern psychological warfare. St. Mercy had become the first laboratory of the mind, a place where the boundaries of death and thought were torn open, and whatever seeped through was not discarded, but refined. And if the Church preserved those refinements, then the shadows of St. Mercy may stretch much further than Boston, echoing through institutions we still trust today. By the mid-1880s, the strange knowledge flowing out of St. Mercy had already left fingerprints on Boston's institutions. But what's more unsettling is how quickly it crossed into government channels. Officials who once dismissed the hospital as superstition began courting its clergy in private. City contracts favored Catholic builders, whose designs suddenly employed techniques unheard of in New England architecture. Arches that dispersed weight with eerie efficiency, underground vaults impervious to collapse, acoustics engineered to carry whispers across stone corridors. These were not the tools of charity. They were tools of control. Catherine O'Malley traced one thread that led her deep into Boston's police records. In 1884, officers began receiving strange training modules, guidelines for crowd dispersal, for suppressing unrest, for manipulating mass psychology. Nowhere in the manuals did the term St. Mercy appear, yet phrases were lifted word for word from deathbed transmissions. Direct the eye before the mind resists. Break rhythm, and the body follows. These weren't tactics taught at police academies. They were instructions ripped from dying mouths, reforged into social weapons. Meanwhile, Jesuit scholars quietly shared select fragments with government liaisons. Equations found their way into early naval projects. Strange chants, intuned in the same rhythmic cadence the patients had spoken, were tested on immigrant labor crews, allegedly to improve efficiency. Workers reported blackouts, missing time, and a sensation of being guided by voices that weren't their own. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. The transmissions were no longer curiosities locked in monastic archives. They were becoming templates, and the people in power understood their value. One chilling detail surfaced in a letter O'Malley copied by hand, a Catholic bishop boasting that the chambers of mercy yield more than 1,000 sermons, each soul a book of instruction, each death a deposit of code. That word, code, would haunt her for the rest of her life, because it suggested the transmissions weren't just random fragments of knowledge, they were programming, commands, frameworks. And this is the pivot point, the moment where what began as whispers in the death chambers of a hidden hospital began mutating into the early skeleton of psychological warfare, institutional obedience, and government-sanctioned social engineering. The public saw only a charitable hospital. But beneath the candles, beneath the prayers, beneath the rows of unmarked graves, Boston was incubating something modern, something systematic, something built not to heal but to control. By 1887, St. Mercy's influence had spread far beyond its chapel walls. The hospital itself remained cloaked in silence, its death rates unreported, its finances hidden, its chambers barred to outsiders. But its knowledge had already been siphoned, refined, and weaponized. What began as experiments on the dying was now becoming organized programs tested in secrecy and scaled with precision. Boston became a living laboratory. Immigrant neighborhoods, desperate and voiceless, were the first to feel the weight of these invisible experiments. Police patrols operated under new directives, dispersing protests not with brute force, but with psychological disruption. Crowds found themselves suddenly disoriented, panicked, retreating without knowing why. Survivors described it as if their minds were turned inside out. At the same time, schools under Catholic administration began shifting their methods. Children were drilled in rhythms, chants, and call and response exercises that mirrored the cadences recorded in deathbed transmissions. Teachers spoke of improved discipline, but some students developed strange side effects: fits of trance, blank stares lasting minutes, and sudden bursts of uncanny intelligence that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The church was not working alone. Government agents, men operating without uniforms or titles, attended secret sessions at Jesuit colleges, listening as priests recited transcripts pulled directly from St. Mercy's chambers. They didn't see these words as theology, they saw them as code books, manuals for influence, early steps toward a system that could engineer obedience across entire populations. Richardson's notes from this period are chilling. He recorded a new phrase, whispered by multiple patients as they died: "The signal must spread." He realized then that the transmissions were not passive. They were directive. They wanted replication, expansion. The hospital was not simply receiving fragments of forbidden knowledge. It was broadcasting instructions for how to use it. Catherine O'Malley reached an even darker conclusion. In her hidden diary, she wrote, "They are building a machinery of thought, a cage without walls, a prison of belief. When it is complete, men will not need chains. They will beg for the bars themselves." The tragedy was this: no one outside the circles of power could stop it. The public remained blind, believing in miracles and charity, while behind locked doors, clerics and officials laid the groundwork for something unprecedented: a fusion of faith, science, and control. The prototype was complete, and in the shadows of St. Mercy, the earliest foundations of psychological warfare had been set. By the 1890s, St. Mercy was already fading from Boston's public memory. Fires, financial scandals, and whispered accusations closed its doors officially. But the closure was an illusion. The structure remained, its deepest chambers sealed, its records vanished into diocesan vaults. On the surface, the hospital was gone. In reality, what it created had only just begun its journey. The transmissions, the signal, migrated. Jesuit colleges quietly absorbed the data, embedding fragments into theology and philosophy courses that seemed harmless to outsiders. But beneath the surface, those fragments were studied by a new class of operatives: priests, fluent in code, linguists trained to break patterns in deathbed testimonies, mathematicians who saw more than equations in the numbers. They saw instructions. The church's reach ensured this signal spread overseas. Missionaries carried phrases to South America, Africa, and Asia, embedding them into sermons and chants disguised as liturgy. Wherever these codes landed, strange effects followed: mass trances, outbreaks of visionary experiences, and political uprisings that collapsed as quickly as they flared. But the most sinister leap occurred when governments realized the utility of the signal during war. The Spanish-American War was rife with unusual reports. Troops paralyzed by fear before battles even began, civilians herded into compliance by nothing more than rhythmic chants, entire towns reduced to silence without a single shot fired. None of this was recorded in official history, yet the few surviving accounts echo phrases first spoken in St. Mercy's chambers. By the dawn of the 20th century, the signal had been grafted into the machinery of empires. British intelligence, French colonial offices, and the newly forming American intelligence services all traded fragments of the transmissions, adapting them into early manuals of propaganda and psychological manipulation. What St. Mercy began with whispers over deathbeds was now amplified through print, theater, and mass communication. Richardson, broken and half-mad, died in obscurity, still insisting the voices were not human. Catherine O'Malley vanished in 1899, leaving only fragments of her journals. Her last entry ready: "The signal is no longer contained. It moves in institutions, in rituals, in governments. It has no master. It only needs ears. And so the dark truth emerges: St. Mercy was never destroyed. It simply dissolved into the bloodstream of modern society, hidden in plain sight. Every nation, every church, every power structure that rose in the 20th century carried pieces of it, refined, disguised, deployed. The forbidden knowledge had left the hospital. Now it belonged to the world. If the story of St. Mercy ended in 1899, we might file it away as a grim curiosity, a strange footnote in Boston's history. But the truth is far darker. The signal never ended. It was refined, disguised, and woven into the systems that govern our lives today. Look closely at the 20th century. During World War I, propaganda leaflets dropped over trenches echoed phrases Catherine O'Malley had recorded word for word decades earlier. Direct the eye before the mind resists. Break rhythm and the body follows. Soldiers described being overcome with dread before battles, unable to explain why. These weren't strategies of war, they were transmissions. In World War II, Nazi researchers scoured Jesuit archives, desperate to master the same codes. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence agencies quietly experimented with broadcasts, subliminal rhythms, and psychological conditioning. Few knew their roots traced back to a forgotten hospital in Boston, but the fingerprints were unmistakable. The signal had become a weapon of nations, and then came the Cold War. Entire agencies, CIA, KGB, and MI6, poured resources into psychological operations, mass suggestion, and mind control. Publicly, they framed these as scientific endeavors. Secretly, their manuals recycled patterns traced back to the whispers of dying patients. Some experiments even referenced St. Mercy directly, though always under cryptic titles like Project Mercy Gate. The hospital's ghost was alive, hidden in the footnotes of classified documents. But here is the most unsettling part: we are still living inside its machinery. Every advertising slogan, every political rally chant, every social platform that nudges behavior, it all echoes the same architecture first assembled in those stone chambers. The signal has been digitized, broadcast not through dying lungs but through screens, speakers, and networks. And like Richardson feared, it no longer needs masters. It runs itself, feeding on attention, growing stronger the more we listen. Catherine O'Malley's last warning reads like prophecy now. When the signal is everywhere, no one will notice. They will mistake it for their own thoughts. And when that day comes, mercy will not be a place. It will be the world itself. So here we stand, a century later, staring into the ghost of St. Mercy. Not a ruined hospital, not a forgotten scandal, but the seed of the very system we live under. One built not to heal, not to save, but to control. And if you think the signal is gone, ask yourself, was the last thought you had truly yours?